My husband cheated on me for almost a year. Then he suggested we adopt a child to save our marriage. When I refused, he filed for divorce and tried to take half the house my late father paid for. That's when I stopped trying to save him. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 37 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed I was a reasonable woman. I believed in talking things through, giving people chances, and not throwing away years of history just because something became difficult. Looking back now, I can see exactly how long I kept giving chances to someone who had already stopped protecting our marriage. 8 years ago, I married Ethan Bennett in a small garden ceremony behind his aunt's house. It was warm that day, the kind of spring afternoon where everything looks softer than it really is. Ethan cried when he saw me walking toward him, and when he slipped the ring onto my finger, his hands were shaking. For years, whenever our marriage hit a rough patch, I would remember that moment and tell myself a man who looked at me that way couldn't possibly become a stranger. I was wrong. Our marriage didn't fall apart all at once. It became quiet first. Ethan started staying later at work, keeping his phone face down at dinner, smiling at messages he didn't explain. If I asked whether something was wrong, he always had an answer ready. He was tired. He was stressed. His team needed him. I wanted to believe him because the alternative was too painful, and after 8 years with someone, denial can feel a lot like loyalty. The truth came out 6 months before the divorce papers. Ethan left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he was upstairs taking a shower. I had gone to look for a recipe we had saved earlier that week, nothing more dramatic than that. Then a notification appeared in the corner of the screen with a name I knew too well. Rachel Harper, his ex-girlfriend. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the screen like it might change if I waited long enough. Rachel was someone Ethan had always described as part of his past. They had dated before he met me, and whenever her name came up, he said it with that casual tone people use when they want you to believe there is nothing underneath it. I should have walked away from the laptop. I didn't. The messages weren't playful or vague. They were intimate in the worst way, comfortable and ordinary, like two people who had already built a private life inside the ruins of someone else's marriage. There were hotel confirmations, dinner reservations, photos, and plans for a weekend trip Ethan had taken while telling me he was away for a work conference. By the time I understood how long it had been going on, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the counter. Nearly a year. Not one drunken night, not one mistake, a year of choices. When Ethan came downstairs, still drying his hair with a towel, he stopped before he even reached the kitchen island. His eyes went from the laptop to my face, and the color drained out of him. I didn't have to say much. He already knew what I had seen. "How long?" I asked. He opened his mouth, closed it, then sat down like his knees had given out. "Claire, please let me explain." "How long?" He looked at the floor. "About 11 months. I remember the silence after that more clearly than anything he said later. It was the silence of 8 years being rewritten in my head. Anniversaries, holidays, lazy Sunday mornings, the times he kissed me goodbye and drove straight into another woman's arms. I had been living in our marriage. He had been renting space in it. He cried that night. Of course he did. He said he loved me, said it had gotten out of hand, said he felt lonely, said we had grown apart. The words came out messy and desperate, and for a few minutes I could still see the man I had married under all that panic. That was the cruel part. If he had been cold, leaving might have been easier. But he looked broken, and I was still enough in love with him to confuse broken with sorry. So I agreed to counseling. I know how that sounds. People listening from the outside always think they would make the clean, proud choice immediately. Maybe some would. I didn't. I had built a life with Ethan, our home, our routines, our families, even the stupid little private jokes that only make sense inside a long marriage. I wasn't ready to accept that all of it had been standing on rotten wood. The first therapy session was awful, but at least Ethan showed up. The second was worse, mostly because the therapist asked questions Ethan didn't want to answer. By the third session, we finally reached the part where real work might begin, and that was exactly when he quit. He said the therapist was biased. He said she focused too much on what he had done and not enough on why he had done it. He said he felt judged. I remember sitting across from him in the car afterward, listening as he explained why being asked to take responsibility was unfair, and something in me went very still. I kept going to therapy alone for several more weeks. Ethan said he supported me, but what he really meant was that he supported anything that allowed him to stop feeling guilty. Then, 2 months after the affair came out, he asked me to sit down with him after dinner. I knew something was wrong the second I saw the dining table. His phone was placed neatly beside a stack of printed articles. There were handwritten notes, highlighted sections, and folders arranged, with the kind of care Ethan usually reserved for work presentations. For one hopeful second, I thought he had finally put together a plan to repair what he had broken. Maybe a new therapist, maybe a separation agreement, maybe a real apology that didn't come wrapped in excuses. Instead, he smiled at me with nervous excitement and said, "I've been thinking about what we need." I sat down slowly. "What we need?" "A fresh start," he said. "Something bigger than us. Something that gives us purpose again." He pushed the papers toward me. At first, the words didn't connect. Adoption agencies, home study requirements, preparing for a child, first-time parent resources. I looked from the pages to Ethan, waiting for the explanation that would make it reasonable. He gave me one. "We should adopt a child." I actually wondered whether I'd heard him correctly. "Ethan, you cannot be serious." "I am serious," he said, leaning forward like he had been waiting for this moment. "A child could bring us together. It would give us something good to focus on instead of constantly going backward." Going backward. That was how he had started describing the affair whenever I brought it up. Not betrayal, not deception, the past. Something inconvenient I kept dragging into the room. I tried to stay calm because I could tell he had already convinced himself this was not only reasonable but noble. He talked about purpose, healing, family, second chances. He showed me articles about adoption strengthening couples and stories of people who became better partners through parenthood. The more he talked, the colder I felt. He wasn't asking to become a father because he was ready to love a child. He was looking for a way to stop feeling like the man who had ruined his marriage. "We are barely stable," I said. "You had an affair for almost a year. You quit counseling after 3 sessions. We are not bringing a child into this." His face tightened. "So that's it? I make one mistake and I'm punished forever?" That word again. Mistake. I stared at him, trying to find the husband I used to know in the man sitting across from me. Sometimes I still saw flashes of him, especially when he looked frightened or ashamed. But then he would say something like that, and the old Ethan disappeared. "This isn't punishment," I said. "This is me being realistic." "No," he said. "This is you refusing to move on." I didn't answer right away. I knew if I let the conversation become another fight about forgiveness, he would pull me into the same exhausting circle we'd been walking for months. So I kept my voice steady. "A child is not a bandage for a broken marriage." He looked wounded, and for a second I almost softened. Then he gathered the papers, shoved back from the table, and walked to the guest room without another word. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next week, Ethan treated adoption like a campaign. He sent me articles, videos, agency links, stories about couples who found meaning after becoming parents. He brought it up over coffee, in the car, while I was brushing my teeth, while I was trying to work from home. At first I answered calmly. Then I asked him to stop. Eventually, I told him if he mentioned adoption one more time as a solution to his affair, I would leave the room. That was when his tone changed. One night in the kitchen, he watched me delete another video without opening it and said, "You're being selfish." I put my mug down. "Excuse me? You don't care about saving this marriage." I remember staring at him, not because the accusation surprised me, but because it finally made something clear. Ethan didn't want a partner in healing. He wanted someone to approve his escape route. "I have spent 6 months trying to save this marriage," I said. "What I won't do is use a child to make you feel less guilty." His face went still. The anger drained out of it so quickly that I almost preferred the shouting. "Fine," he said. "You're entitled to your opinion." Then he stopped talking about adoption. Completely. For 4 days, the house became quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. Ethan moved through rooms politely, almost gently. He asked if I needed anything from the store. He washed dishes without making comments. He even sat outside one night long after midnight, staring into the dark with a beer untouched beside him. Watching him through the window, I felt that old ache again, the memory of loving someone before you learned what they were capable of. I wanted to believe the silence meant he had finally understood. Instead, it meant he had changed tactics. 1 month later, security called my office and said legal documents had been delivered for me. I knew before I opened the envelope that Ethan was behind it. Still, seeing the divorce petition in black and white felt different. It was public now, official. A private collapse stamped and filed and handed to me in front of coworkers who pretended not to look. Ethan was filing for divorce. He also stated that he intended to move forward with adoption as a single parent. But the part that made my hands go cold came several pages later. He wanted an equal division of marital assets, including the house. Our house. The house we had bought 4 years earlier with an $85,000 down payment from my father's life insurance money after he died. My father hadn't been rich. He worked hard, lived carefully, and left behind what he could so I would have something stable. I would have given back every dollar to have him alive for one more day, but that money became the foundation of the home Ethan now wanted to split as if it had come from both of us equally. The worst part was that I had once tried to protect it. When we bought the house, I suggested putting something in writing about the inheritance portion. Ethan got offended immediately. He asked if I trusted him. He said marriage didn't work if people kept score. He made me feel cold and suspicious for wanting basic protection over money that came from my dead father, so I dropped it. Sitting in my car outside work with the divorce papers on my lap, I realized how expensive that guilt had become. That afternoon, I called a divorce attorney named Andrea Rivera. She had been recommended by a colleague who told me she was calm, sharp, and not easily intimidated. By 5 o'clock, I was in her office with every document I could find: estate records, bank statements, mortgage paperwork, closing documents, and the transfer showing my inheritance money going directly into escrow for the house. Andrea listened without interrupting while I told her everything: Rachel, the affair, the failed therapy, the adoption obsession, the divorce filing. When I finished, she reviewed the inheritance documents in silence. I watched her face carefully, trying to read whether I had any chance at all. Finally, she tapped one of the statements with her pen. "This is good." I almost laughed from nerves. It doesn't feel good. "I don't mean emotionally," she said. "I mean legally. The money went directly from your inheritance account to the down payment, and you have documentation. That matters." For the first time all day, I felt my lungs open. Andrea leaned back in her chair. "Your husband may be assuming the house is automatically 50-50. Based on these records, I don't think it's going to be that simple. We can file a counterpetition asking the court to recognize your separate property interest." I looked down at the papers again, at my father's name, at the numbers, at the proof Ethan clearly hoped would not matter. "What are the realistic chances?" "No attorney should promise an outcome," Andrea said. "But with this documentation, you have a strong case. At minimum, we fight to protect the inheritance contribution. Depending on how the rest of the facts come out, we may be able to position you to keep the house." Keep the house. Until that moment, I had been thinking only in terms of survival, responding, defending, trying not to fall apart. But hearing those words changed something. Ethan had filed first because he thought speed would give him control. He thought I would be too hurt, too embarrassed, or too tired to fight. He forgot something important. I had already lost the version of him I loved. I wasn't going to lose my father's last gift, too. Andrea closed the folder and looked at me. "Do you want to proceed?" I didn't need time to think. "File it." And that was the moment Ethan learned the divorce he started was not going to end the way he planned. The counterpetition hit Ethan harder than I expected. Looking back, I think that's because he never seriously considered the possibility that I would fight back. He knew me as the woman who compromised first, apologized first, and spent months trying to hold our marriage together after he set it on fire. Somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that version of me would keep showing up no matter what he did. Instead, less than a week after Andrea filed the response, his phone calls started. At first, they sounded almost confused. "Claire, why are you doing this?" As if the question genuinely puzzled him. As if I had woken up one morning and randomly decided to challenge him in court. The second voicemail was more frustrated. The third was angry. By the fifth, he had settled into a familiar role, the misunderstood victim. "You don't have to make this ugly." I listened to that message twice before deleting it. Ugly. The word stuck with me because people like Ethan always seem to redefine events according to where they are standing. The affair wasn't ugly. The lies weren't ugly. The divorce papers delivered to my workplace weren't ugly. Apparently, the ugly part started the moment I hired a lawyer and stopped absorbing the consequences of his decisions. Andrea's instructions were simple. Save everything. Respond to nothing. So that's what I did. The calls kept coming for several days before Ethan changed tactics. The next call came from his mother. That one hurt more than I expected. Before all this happened, I genuinely liked Linda. She wasn't overbearing or controlling. She always remembered birthdays. She brought homemade desserts to family gatherings and treated me like a daughter from the day Ethan introduced us. At least that's what I thought. She started the conversation gently. "Claire, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" The concern sounded real. For a few minutes, I almost relaxed. Then she slowly guided the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. "Ethan is having a very hard time." I stared through my office window. "I'm sure he is." "He's devastated." I didn't answer. She took my silence as permission to continue. "He knows he made mistakes." There was that word again. Mistakes. The affair had become a mistake. The lying had become a mistake. The divorce filing had become a mistake. Funny how intentional choices suddenly transform into mistakes once consequences arrive. Linda sighed. "He's trying to build a future, Claire." I felt something inside me tighten. He had a future. Another sigh. "He loves you." I almost laughed. Not because the statement was impossible. Because love had become the least useful word in the conversation. Love doesn't spend 11 months sneaking around. Love doesn't pressure someone into adopting a child to repair damage it created. Love doesn't serve divorce papers and immediately ask for part of an inheritance. I don't think we have the same definition of love anymore. Silence. Then her voice cooled slightly. "You're angry." "Of course I'm angry." "But you're letting that anger control you." That was when I realized this conversation was never about understanding me. It was about persuading me, about making me feel guilty enough to stop protecting myself. I ended the call politely. Afterward, I sat at my desk for several minutes, wondering how many people Ethan had already told his version of the story. The answer arrived sooner than expected. A few days later, I came home from work and found moving boxes on the front porch. For a second, I thought someone had delivered them by mistake. Then the front door opened, and Ethan walked out carrying one of them. I stopped in the driveway. He stopped too. Neither of us looked particularly happy to see the other. "I'm moving back in," he announced. Not asking. Not discussing. Announcing. I stared at him. "What?" "My lawyer says I have every right to be here until the divorce is finalized." Technically, he wasn't wrong. Both our names were still attached to the property. Legally speaking, he could move back in. Emotionally speaking, it felt like someone had dropped a snake into my bed and informed me it was perfectly within its rights to be there. I expected a fight. So did Ethan. I could see it in his posture. He was prepared, waiting, almost eager. Instead, I surprised both of us. "The guest room is empty." His expression changed immediately. Only slightly. But enough. He hadn't wanted permission. He wanted conflict. Without another word, I walked past him and headed inside. Living with your husband while actively divorcing him is a unique form of psychological exhaustion. Every ordinary moment becomes contaminated. A simple dinner feels like a negotiation. Passing each other in the hallway feels like crossing enemy territory. Even silence starts carrying meaning. The strange thing was that Ethan kept behaving as if the divorce had happened to him rather than because of him. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same topic: the house. Always the house. One evening, I was unloading groceries when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. The look on his face told me he had rehearsed whatever was coming next. "Can I ask you something?" I already knew where this was headed. "Sure." He crossed his arms. "Are you really going to fight me over the house?" I set a carton of eggs on the counter and turned toward him. The question fascinated me, not because of what it asked, because of everything it ignored. The affair, the lies, the therapy he abandoned, the adoption pressure, the divorce filing. All of that had somehow vanished from the conversation. Only the house remained. Ethan, his jaw tightened immediately. He knew from my tone he wasn't going to like the answer. "You cheated on me." "That's not what I asked." "You filed for divorce." "Claire, you spent months trying to convince me a child would solve problems you refused to address." Frustration flashed across his face. "Can we stay on topic?" I actually laughed. Not a bitter laugh. A genuinely stunned one. Because somehow, in Ethan's mind, the topic was my reaction, not his behavior. That realization explained almost everything. He wasn't sorry about what he had done. He was angry that it hadn't worked. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The confidence drained out of him. Just for a moment. Long enough for me to recognize the man I used to know. He looked tired. Older. Like someone carrying around the weight of a life that wasn't unfolding the way he'd imagined. "I didn't think we'd end up here." The words came out quietly. Almost honest. And that was the problem. Sometimes Ethan said things that reminded me why I married him. Small moments where I could see genuine regret underneath all the self-justification. For a second, I remembered road trips, birthdays, lazy Sundays on the couch, and the version of us that existed before Rachel. Then he ruined it. You could make this easier. There it was. Not accountability. Not ownership. Not an apology. A request. A negotiation. A way around consequences. I picked up another grocery bag. You keep acting like this happened to you. His expression hardened. That's not fair. No, I said quietly. The affair wasn't fair. The conversation ended there. Or at least I thought it had. Unfortunately, Ethan wasn't done trying to influence the outcome. A week later, I came home early because a meeting had been canceled. The house felt wrong the moment I walked inside. Not dramatically wrong, just different. The kind of feeling you get when something small has been moved and your brain notices before your eyes do. I couldn't immediately identify it. Then I saw my office door. Open. I always closed it before leaving. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I walked upstairs. And what I found changed the entire direction of the divorce. The cold feeling in my stomach got worse with every step I took upstairs. At first, I couldn't explain why. Nothing looked obviously wrong. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no signs that anyone had forced their way inside. Yet the closer I got to my office, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. When I reached the doorway, I immediately saw it. One of the filing cabinet drawers was open. Not slightly open. Pulled all the way out. Papers were spread across the desk. Several folders sat on the floor, and standing in the middle of the room was Ethan. For a second, neither of us moved. His expression told me everything before either of us spoke. He wasn't supposed to be there, and he knew it. "What are you doing?" The question came out calmer than I felt. Ethan straightened immediately. I was looking for documents. My eyes moved to the filing cabinet, then to the folders, then back to him. "What documents?" "Financial records." I walked farther into the room. "Why?" He hesitated, only for a second. But I noticed. For my lawyer. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. The problem was that we both knew how legal discovery worked. Lawyers exchanged documents through attorneys. They didn't secretly search through filing cabinets when nobody was home. That wasn't legal preparation. That was something else. I looked more carefully at the papers spread across the desk. Then I saw the folder tucked beneath Ethan's arm, and my stomach dropped. I recognized it immediately. Inheritance records. The folder containing documentation from my father's estate. The same records Andrea had identified as one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the case. "What are you holding?" Ethan glanced down. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing important." The answer told me everything. I held out my hand. "Give it to me." His jaw flexed. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he slowly handed over the folder. I opened it. Bank statements. Transfer records. Estate documentation. The entire paper trail connecting my father's insurance money to the house down payment. Exactly the documents Ethan had spent weeks pretending weren't important. I looked back up at him. "What were you planning to do with these?" "I told you, show them to my lawyer." Maybe he even believed that answer. The problem was that it didn't explain why he was searching through my files while I wasn't home. And judging by the look on his face, he knew it didn't. The room went quiet. Not angry quiet. Careful quiet. The kind where both people are thinking several moves ahead. For the first time since the divorce started, I saw something underneath Ethan's confidence. Fear. Not panic. Not desperation. Fear. The fear of someone beginning to understand that reality might not bend itself into the shape they expected. Without saying another word, I pulled out my phone and started taking photographs. The open drawers. The scattered papers. The inheritance folder. Everything. "What are you doing?" "Documenting." His expression darkened. "Claire, that's ridiculous." "No." I snapped another photo. "What's ridiculous is finding you digging through my father's records." His face flushed. "You're making this sound worse than it is." I almost laughed. The sentence felt painfully familiar. That had been Ethan's strategy for months. The affair wasn't as bad as it looked. The lies weren't as bad as they sounded. The adoption pressure wasn't as unreasonable as I thought. Now this. Everything was always slightly less serious in Ethan's version of reality. Unfortunately for him, courts tend to prefer documentation over interpretations. As soon as he left the room, I emailed every photograph to Andrea. Her response arrived surprisingly fast. A few minutes later, my phone rang. "Tell me exactly what happened." I walked her through everything. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then Andrea spoke, and for the first time since the divorce started, she sounded genuinely pleased. "This helps us." I blinked. "What?" People don't usually start digging through documents like that unless they're worried about what's inside them. The thought hadn't occurred to me. But once she said it, it made sense. Ethan wasn't acting like someone confident in his position. He was acting like someone looking for a way around a problem. Andrea continued, I think we should file for temporary exclusive occupancy. I sat down. You think we have a chance? I think a judge is going to have concerns about someone accessing financial records this way. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced much lately. Hope. Careful hope. The kind that doesn't trust itself yet. The hearing happened less than 3 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic. Real courtrooms almost never are. No shocking confessions. No dramatic speeches. Just facts. Andrea presented the photographs, the timeline, the details of what happened. Ethan's attorney tried to minimize everything, arguing that it was a misunderstanding between spouses during a divorce. The judge listened politely, then asked a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. If these records were needed, why weren't they requested through counsel? The courtroom became very quiet, because there wasn't a good answer. By the end of the hearing, the ruling was clear. I would receive temporary exclusive occupancy of the home. Ethan would have 2 weeks to move out. The decision wasn't permanent. Property division would come later. But for now, the house would be mine. When we stepped outside the courthouse afterward, Ethan looked stunned. Not furious. Not yet. Just stunned. As if some part of him genuinely believed things would continue going his way, no matter what evidence appeared. That expression didn't last. By the time he started packing, the shock had transformed into resentment. The first few days were tense but manageable. Then the comments started. Little remarks about greed, about revenge, about money changing people. I ignored most of them. Arguing felt pointless. The facts weren't changing. The court order wasn't changing. And no conversation was going to rewrite the previous 18 months. On the final day, Ethan's older sister arrived to help him move. She had always been polite to me before the divorce. Never especially close. Never unfriendly. Now she barely looked at me. As they loaded the last boxes into her SUV, she eventually approached me while Ethan was carrying another load from the garage. For a few seconds, she just stood there. Then she said something I'd hear variations of many times over the following months. You know he really loved you, right? The question caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't considered it, because I had. Far more often than people imagined. Loving someone and hurting them aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes that's what makes betrayal so devastating. I looked toward the driveway where Ethan was loading another box, then back at her. I think he loved me. Her expression softened slightly. Then I continued. I just don't think he loved me more than he loved avoiding consequences. The softness disappeared immediately. Neither of us said another word. A few minutes later, Ethan loaded the final box. Before getting into the SUV, he stood in the driveway staring at the house. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Not because he deserved sympathy, because I knew exactly what he was losing. I had lost it too. The difference was that I hadn't thrown it away. Eventually, he climbed into the passenger seat. The vehicle pulled out of the driveway and disappeared around the corner. I stood there long after it was gone. The silence felt strange. The house felt bigger, lighter. For the first time in months, I could walk from one room to another without wondering when the next argument would start. What I didn't realize yet was that the hardest evidence hadn't even surfaced. Because once financial discovery began, Ethan's version of the story would start falling apart piece by piece. And the person responsible for most of that damage wasn't going to be me. It was going to be Ethan himself. Financial discovery started about a month after Ethan moved out. Before the divorce, I had never given much thought to how thoroughly courts examine people's lives. I understood the concept in theory, but theory feels very different when you're sitting at a conference table watching years of financial decisions get organized into binders. Andrea warned me it would be invasive. She wasn't exaggerating. Every account, every statement, every transaction, every debt, everything became visible. The strange part was that I didn't mind. After months of lies, visibility felt refreshing. My side was straightforward. The inheritance records matched the bank statements. The bank statements matched the closing documents. The closing documents matched the house purchase. There were no hidden accounts, no unexplained transfers, no mystery expenses, just paperwork. Clean and boring. Andrea reviewed everything and seemed pleased. If every client kept records like this, my job would be a lot easier. I smiled. It wasn't much of a compliment, but after the previous year, I'd learned to appreciate small victories. Then Ethan's financial disclosures arrived, and suddenly things became much more interesting. The first surprise was 3 credit cards I didn't know existed. At first, I assumed they were relatively minor. People open credit cards all the time. Then Andrea started reviewing the balances. $28,000. I leaned forward. That's all his? Andrea nodded. Looks that way. My surprise quickly turned into confusion. Ethan earned a decent salary. We had never been wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. Accumulating that kind of debt wasn't impossible, but it certainly wasn't normal. Then we looked at the statements. The answer appeared almost immediately. The statements painted a very clear picture: expensive restaurants, hotel stays, luxury weekend trips, and resort charges that lined up almost perfectly with the timeline of Ethan's affair. There was no mystery left. The receipts told the entire story on their own. Looking at the statements, I realized how many lies had been hiding behind ordinary explanations I'd accepted without question. I sat back in my chair. The irony was almost impressive. For months, Ethan had insisted the affair wasn't worth losing our marriage over. Apparently, it had been worth quite a lot financially. Andrea continued turning pages. Then she stopped. Well, I frowned. What? She slid another statement across the table. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed the purchases. Cribs, nursery furniture, baby monitors, children's bedding, adoption guides, home preparation materials. The dates made my stomach tighten. Almost all of it had been purchased after our arguments about adoption began. While I was still trying to save the marriage, Ethan had apparently been preparing for a completely different future, one that assumed everything would work out exactly the way he wanted. I couldn't decide what bothered me more, the spending or the certainty behind it, because those purchases revealed something important. Ethan never truly believed I might say no. He thought persistence would eventually wear me down, and when it didn't, he assumed the divorce would. When neither worked, reality finally started pushing back. The first hearing involving debt allocation was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Even Ethan looked uneasy. His attorney attempted to argue that the credit card balances represented marital debt. Technically, there was some legal basis for the argument. Unfortunately for them, the details mattered. The judge spent several minutes reviewing statements before speaking. Help me understand this. Nobody interrupted. The judge flipped another page. Your client accumulated substantial debt during an extramarital relationship. Ethan stared at the table. The judge continued. Then accumulated additional debt preparing for an adoption process that had not been agreed to by both spouses. The silence grew heavier, and now wishes opposing counsel's client to share responsibility for those expenses. Even Ethan's lawyer seemed uncomfortable hearing it summarized that way, because when stripped down to the facts, it sounded exactly as unreasonable as it was. The judge reserved final ruling for later, but nobody left that courtroom feeling optimistic about Ethan's position. Least of all Ethan. Around the same time, another problem started developing. Social media. Normally, I wouldn't have cared. By that point, I was too busy dealing with lawyers and paperwork to spend much time online. But mutual friends started sending screenshots. At first, I ignored them. Then, curiosity got the better of me. The version of events Ethan was sharing looked very different from the one appearing in court. According to social media, he was bravely rebuilding his life after a painful separation. There were inspirational quotes, posts about growth, posts about becoming a stronger person, posts about future fatherhood, posts about resilience. What was missing was far more interesting. No mention of Rachel, no mention of the affair, no mention of the adoption pressure, no mention of the inheritance dispute, no mention of the divorce filing, just carefully edited optimism. I almost admired the commitment. Almost. Then something unexpected happened. People started learning the truth. Not because I was telling everyone. I wasn't. The court filings existed. The timeline existed. The evidence existed. And once enough pieces started circulating, Ethan's version became increasingly difficult to maintain. One afternoon, a mutual friend called me. Mark, someone I'd known through Ethan for years. The conversation started awkwardly. Then he sighed. I owe you an apology. I honestly didn't know what he meant. For what? There was a pause. I thought you were being harsh. I leaned back in my chair. Mark sounded embarrassed. Ethan told people you were trying to ruin him. I wasn't surprised. What changed? Someone showed me the court filings. Another pause. The whole story looks very different with all the facts. I stared out the window. For months, I'd imagined feeling vindicated if people finally understood. Instead, I mostly felt exhausted. Because being right doesn't undo what happened. It just confirms it. Thanks for calling. I should have asked questions before picking sides. Probably. He laughed weakly. Fair enough. After we hung up, I sat there for several minutes thinking about how easily narratives spread when only one person is talking. Fortunately, courts care less about narratives than evidence. And evidence was becoming Ethan's biggest problem. The final hearing arrived roughly 3 months after the divorce began. By then, both sides had presented almost everything. The affair, the debt, the house, the inheritance. The adoption plans, the document incident, the financial records. Nothing significant remained hidden. Andrea's argument regarding the house was remarkably simple. She didn't overcomplicate it. She didn't need to. The $85,000 down payment came directly from my inheritance. The documentation proved it. The remaining equity accumulated during the marriage could be divided appropriately, but the inheritance contribution itself remained separate property. Clear. Direct. Supported by evidence. Ethan's attorney fought hard. I can't blame him for trying. It was his job. But the more he argued, the more obvious the underlying problem became. The facts weren't cooperating. After closing arguments, the judge took the matter under advisement. Then we waited. Those 2 days felt longer than the previous 2 months. Not because I thought we would lose, because uncertainty has its own kind of weight. When the ruling finally arrived, I sat in Andrea's office, reading it twice before speaking. Then a third time. Just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it, I got the house. The court recognized the inheritance contribution. The remaining marital equity would be divided. I would pay Ethan his share. The credit card debt remained his responsibility. The court also noted issues involving financial disclosures and his handling of certain information during the case. By the time I finished reading, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not triumph. Not revenge. Relief. Like a muscle I'd been holding tight for months had finally relaxed. Andrea smiled. Congratulations. I nodded. Thank you. A week later, I signed the refinance paperwork. A few days after that, Ethan received his settlement payment. The exchange happened at a lawyer's office. Professional. Brief. Awkward. He barely looked at me. His attorney accepted the paperwork. Everything was confirmed. Then Ethan stood up and left. No dramatic speech. No final argument. Just silence. His mother was waiting in the hallway. She looked at me with the same disappointment she'd carried for months. I hope you're happy. I met her gaze. I didn't do this. Linda opened her mouth as if she wanted to argue. Then her eyes dropped to the settlement paperwork in her hands. For the first time since the divorce began, she had nothing to say. A few seconds later, she turned and walked away. The divorce became official shortly afterward. I honestly believed that would be the end of the story. The papers were signed. The house was mine. Ethan had received his settlement, and legally there was nothing left to fight about. I was wrong. Over the following months, the consequences of the choices Ethan had made started catching up with him in ways neither of us expected. For the first few weeks after the divorce became official, I kept waiting to feel something dramatic. I expected some grand feeling. Freedom, closure, maybe even relief. Some grand emotional release people talk about after surviving a difficult chapter of their lives. Instead, most mornings felt surprisingly ordinary. I still woke up at the same time, still made coffee, still drove the same route to work. The biggest difference was the absence of tension. Nobody was waiting in the kitchen to restart an argument. Nobody was trying to convince me that reality meant something different from what it clearly did. The house was quiet. And after everything that had happened, quiet felt luxurious. There were moments when the silence hurt. I'd walk past a room and remember a holiday dinner or a lazy Sunday afternoon. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for my phone because something funny happened and Ethan would have been the first person I told. Those moments never lasted very long, because the next memory usually arrived right behind them. Then I'd remember Rachel, the months of lies, the pressure to adopt, and the divorce that followed. Whatever nostalgia I felt usually disappeared after that. And just like that, nostalgia would lose its grip. A few weeks later, I started repainting rooms. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make the house feel like mine again. I replaced furniture Ethan had picked out, rearranged a few spaces, cleared out closets. Small changes, but each one helped separate the life I had from the life I thought I was going to have. Then came the first piece of news about Ethan. I heard it through a mutual friend. Apparently, his adoption plans weren't going well. At first, I didn't pay much attention. The adoption process was no longer my concern. Ethan had made it very clear he intended to move forward without me. Then more details surfaced. The agencies weren't rejecting him because he was divorced. They were concerned about stability. One agency reportedly told him they wanted to see a longer period of financial and residential stability before moving forward. Given everything that had happened over the previous year, that wasn't something he could provide. Between the debt, the housing situation, and the instability created by the divorce, Ethan simply couldn't demonstrate the kind of consistency the agencies were looking for. Individually, none of those factors guaranteed a denial. Together, they created problems. Real problems. The kind that don't disappear because someone wants them to. When I first heard it, I felt something complicated. Not satisfaction. Certainly not happiness. More like inevitability. The same feeling you get watching someone ignore warning signs for months and then act surprised when they eventually reach the cliff. Ethan had treated adoption like a solution, a destination, a reward waiting for him at the end of the road. The agencies viewed it differently. They saw responsibility, preparation, stability, exactly the things I had been trying to explain all along. Several weeks later, another update arrived. He'd been denied by more than one agency. That was when I started noticing something else. The social media posts changed. The inspirational messages became less frequent. The references to fatherhood disappeared. The optimistic future he'd been publicly constructing started quietly fading away. Nobody announced it. Nobody acknowledged it. The posts simply stopped. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, Ethan had accused me of refusing to face the future. In reality, he had spent that same period imagining a future that only worked if nobody held him accountable for the choices he'd already made. Reality finally arrived, and reality was expensive. The second major update involved Rachel, or rather, the absence of Rachel. As far as anyone could tell, she was gone. The relationship that had been important enough to risk an 8-year marriage suddenly seemed remarkably fragile once secrecy was removed from the equation. Apparently, once Ethan was actually available, things didn't last very long. Again, I wasn't celebrating, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. The fantasy kept collapsing whenever it came into contact with real life. Months earlier, Ethan had been willing to gamble everything because he believed something better was waiting on the other side. Now the marriage was gone. The house was gone. The adoption plans were stalled, and Rachel was gone. The fantasy had turned into paperwork, bills, and consequences. One afternoon, several months after the divorce, I received an unexpected text message from Ethan. The first direct contact in quite a while. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part was curious. Eventually, curiosity won. I agreed to meet him outside the house. My house. That distinction still felt strange sometimes. When I arrived, Ethan was already there. When I first saw him, it took me a second to reconcile the man standing there with the one I'd been married to. Not because he looked dramatically different. Because he looked tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from missing sleep. The kind that comes from carrying disappointment for a long time. Watching him stand there, I found myself wondering whether he even recognized the person he'd become. Sometimes I wasn't sure I did. The man I married wasn't perfect, but he hadn't always been this defensive or this determined to avoid responsibility. Somewhere between the affair and the divorce, he'd spent so much time justifying his decisions that he seemed to lose sight of who he used to be. We stood awkwardly for a few seconds. Then he glanced toward the house. "It looks different." "I've been making changes." He nodded. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot." That sentence would have annoyed me months earlier. Now it mostly made me cautious, because thinking had rarely improved situations where Ethan was concerned. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know I handled a lot of things badly. A lot of things." Interesting phrasing. Not everything. Not specifically the affair. Not specifically the divorce. Just things. I waited. Eventually, he continued. "I shouldn't have pushed so hard about adoption." That surprised me. Not because it was a full apology, because it was closer than anything I'd received before. I studied his face. For the first time in a long time, he seemed genuinely uncertain. Not defensive. Not persuasive. Just uncertain. And for a brief moment, I saw the version of Ethan I had once loved. The man who used to sit beside me on long drives and talk about our future. The man who cried at our wedding. The man I spent 8 years believing I knew. Then he ruined it. "I still think you didn't have to go after the house the way you did." There it was. The same wall we'd been hitting for over a year. Different words. Same destination. He still viewed himself as the injured party. Still believed the consequences were somehow more significant than the choices that created them. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Not frustration. Acceptance. The realization that some people never tell the story accurately because doing so would require them to become the villain in their own version of events. "Ethan," he looked at me. "You cheated on me for almost a year." His expression tightened. "You filed for divorce." He looked away. "You tried to claim part of my father's inheritance." Silence. "You spent months acting like all of that happened to you instead of because of you." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he sighed. A long, tired sigh. The kind people make when reality refuses to become negotiable. "I guess we're never going to agree." He looked toward the house again. "Sometimes I wish I could go back and make different choices." It wasn't a complete apology. Maybe it never would be. But it was the closest Ethan had come to acknowledging the damage he'd caused. "No," I smiled sadly. "We're not." Another silence. Then Ethan nodded. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to convince me I was being unfair. He simply nodded. A few moments later, he walked back to his car. Before getting in, he looked toward the house one last time. Then he drove away. And that was the last time I saw him. At least so far. The funny thing about endings is that they rarely feel dramatic when they finally arrive. Most of the time, life simply keeps moving. Life isn't perfect now. I still have trust issues. I still have moments where I wonder how long the affair would have continued if I hadn't discovered it. I still occasionally miss the person I thought Ethan was. But I don't miss the reality. There's a difference. The house feels like home again. Work is going well. Friends who disappeared during the divorce slowly returned once they learned the full story. Some apologized. Others didn't. Either way, I stopped caring. What happened no longer needs a jury. The evidence already answered every important question. A while ago, my mother asked whether fighting for the house had really been worth it. The legal fees, the stress, the months of conflict. I didn't have to think very long about my answer. Yes, not because I wanted revenge, and not because I wanted Ethan to suffer. It was worth it because the house represented something bigger than property. My father spent his life trying to create stability for the people he loved. The inheritance wasn't just money to me. It represented years of my father's hard work and the last act of care he was able to leave behind. Protecting it felt less like winning a legal battle and more like honoring a promise I never got the chance to make to him. That's why I never saw the house as a prize to win. I saw it as something worth protecting. Looking back, I don't think Ethan and I were fighting over the same thing by the end. He was focused on what he'd lost. I was focused on protecting what remained. Maybe that's why every conversation felt like we were speaking different languages. As for me, I stopped carrying his choices a long time ago. Now I carry my keys, walk into my house, and continue building the life that remains. And for the first time in years, that feels like enough.